Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait just a few seconds to let everyone come into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Providence College Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain and I'm a member of the Philosophy Department and the Humanities Program here at PC and the director of the forum. The Humanities Forum is an initiative of the Humanities Program and exists to provide a regular space each Friday for the entire college community to reflect on some of the deepest human things. Before we begin this afternoon, let me remind you that today's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website early next week. Also, please remember that you can ask a question at any point during today's presentation by typing in the Q&A box available at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to submit questions whenever they occur to you during the discussion. And as always, we'll do our best to get to as many as possible before we conclude. We are delighted today to welcome to our virtual campus two very distinguished guests. But before I introduce them, I would first like to introduce Justin Cameron, who's helping me host this afternoon's discussion. Justin is a sophomore here at PC and comes to us from the Boston area. He's also a member of a special class this semester studying the work and legacy of the 19th century Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, whose book, Democracy in America, remains one of the most thoughtful reflections ever written about American social and political life. I'm delighted that Justin's able to join us this afternoon for our conversation with our two special guests, Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. Robert Putnam is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. In 2006, he received the Skytte Prize, the world's highest accolade for a political scientist. And in 2013, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal, the nation's highest honor for contributions to the humanities, for deepening our understanding of community in America. Among his many books are Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, one of the most cited and best-selling social science works in the last half century, and Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, which as it happens is another important book for our course on Alexis de Tocqueville. At the heart of his work is reflection on and pursuit of genuine social and political community. And his counsel over the years has been sought by national and grassroots leaders on both sides of the aisle and across the world. Over the last several decades, he's also worked directly with thousands of grassroots leaders in scores of local communities coast to coast across America. Shaylyn Romney Garrett is a writer who has dedicated her life to the pursuit of connection, community, and healing in an increasingly fragmented world. Her work includes uniquely revealing portraits of religious communities across the United States, and she is a founding contributor to the Aspen Institute's initiative, Weave, the Social Fabric Project. With her husband, James Garrett, she co-founded Think Unlimited, a nonprofit venture working to catalyze social innovation in the Middle East. Her work has been featured by the New York Times, Fast Company, LinkedIn, Harvard Business Review, and Arab Investor. And in 2011, she was honored with the prestigious Draper Richards Kaplan Social Entrepreneurship Fellowship. Together, they researched and wrote this book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. Published just last October, this is a remarkable consideration of the long sweep of the 20th century in America, written always with a view to what we might hope for and work towards today in these most polarized and complicated of times. It's a real honor to have them with us here today to discuss their work, and we're very much looking forward to this afternoon's conversation.
Thanks very much, Raymond. And Justin, thanks for hosting this. And Shaylyn and I are delighted to be here. What I'd like to do is give you, we will together give you a short overview of the content of the book. I'll speak first, and I am, of the two of us, I'm a little bit more the counter. Therefore, I'm going to be talking a little more about statistics, and Shaylyn is a little bit more the poet. And so she'll describe the narrative that lies behind the numbers. And then we'll get to the really important part of the book, which is not just describing history, but trying to extract some lessons from history for the current times. I want to begin, Raymond, by noting that this book was completely finished, off in print last January, more than a year ago. So the book, as we're going to describe it at the beginning, and as it's on the shelf that you described, you showed your viewers a little while ago, that book was written without any knowledge of the pandemic, without any knowledge of the economic crisis we've been through, without any knowledge about the elections, nothing, no knowledge about January 6th, no knowledge about the $1.9 billion stimulus package. We knew nothing about that when we described the book. And we're going to start by the book as it is. But of course, we're sentient human beings, and we've been following the events of the last year and the last month and the last week. And so we're happy later on in the discussion to try to apply the book to a period that was not in our minds at the time that we wrote the book. If we can have the first slide, Raymond, I think this will start us off with just an overview. The cover is just the, let's see if we got it there, perfect. As you can see, this is the title of the book there, and you can see in the, on the cover, there's this funny upside down curve there, this inverted U-shaped curve, and we're gonna be talking a little bit about that pretty soon, actually. So maybe let's go to the next slide. Here's the starting point. America's in a pickle. And by that, I mean, just about the only thing that we Americans agree about now is that we're in a pickle. Things are really bad. And to be a little more statistical about it, what that reflects is the fact that America today is more polarized politically than just about at any period in our history, more unequal economically than just about any time in American history, more socially isolated, socially fragmented, again, than just about any time in our history. And although this is a little harder to measure, we believe it's true, more culturally self-centered or narcissistic than ever in our history. And so the question at the beginning of the book is, how do we get here? And if we have the next slide, I want to sort of show you some pictures that will be summaries of what's happened. And if you like numbers, sometimes pictures are an easy way to see what's going on. If you don't like numbers, don't worry. I'll be talking about what's happened here, and then in a minute, Shaylyn's going to be saying even more in narrative terms of the picture. She's going to be describing what was happening behind these graphs. The horizontal axis here you see runs from 1880, the end of the 18th century, a period that is called historically in American history the Gilded Age. And we'll see shortly why it was called the Gilded Age. And then at the other end, we have today, right up to as close as we can to 2021. And the vertical axis are measures of, in a way, the things I just described. In this case, we're looking at politics and how American politics has changed over the period from, in this case, we have good data from 1895 to 2015. And as you can see, the data start over there at the left-hand side in 1895. America at that point is very, very polarized. It's not so well known how well polarized America was in that period. And it's low here because we've oriented these graphs so that up is good. And in this case, up is political comedy or bipartisanship, getting along politically. And as you can see, America was unbelievably divided back there. You can't see earlier in American history, but it's a graph like this that tells us that the only time America was ever that low in terms of, political polarization was 1860 to 1865, the Civil War. So this was an extremely polarized period, that period around 1890, and 1900. But then, as you can see, beginning around 1900, things begin to change a little bit. And Americans start working a little bit more across party lines. and people start voting together a little bit more across party lines, and voters start splitting their ticket, that is seeing good on both sides of the aisle. And that the red line shows how that rises steadily, America becoming less polarized through the 20s and 30s and into the 40s and into the 50s, and finally reaches its peak in the middle 50s. The president up there in the middle 50s was President Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was a very interesting president because by just virtually all historians' accounts, he was the least partisan president in American history. For example, both the Republicans and the Democrats came very close to nominating him as their candidate. I'm not saying that he caused the depolarization or the degree of political cross-party collaboration. He was more a symptom of it, but it's a very good symptom, or a very good symbol, I mean, of what was going on. But then pretty soon, you see, as we go into the 60s, we begin to become a little less, we begin to become a little more polarized, a little less cooperative across party lines. And then that trend continues uninterruptedly, a steady plunge over the last 50 years, down through the 80s and down through the 90s and down through the first decade of the 20th century and down of the 21st century and down through the teens. And actually, we know what the data look like today as of 2021. And if we put them on the graph, they would be even lower. They'd be down actually at the very bottom corner. America could hardly be more polarized in terms of party lines. Party lines in Congress, for example, have never been so stark as they are right today. So that's the trend over the last century, 125 years. America started as a kind of a very divided. We became quite not united, but certainly tolerant across party lines in the middle of the century, but then plunged back down to where we are now. But let's have the next slide. And this is the same sort of trend, but the next slide shows economic equality. That is, these are various measures of the gaps between rich and poor. And the data here begin in 1913, which is when the IRS is created. So beginning in 1913, we have very good data, but we know that even before 1913, there was even greater inequality. The gap between the rich folks in that period, that's why it was called the Gilded Age. It was a huge gap between the rich folks living on the Upper East Side of New York, you know, the Rockefellers and the Mellons and the robber barons, basically. Huge gap between them and the poor immigrants living just 10 miles south in on the Lower East Side. Enormous gap. And you can see that when this data set begins, we can see it's already very low. It then begins, however, a little more gain in equality between there. And then there's a pause. You can see a little bit of a pause in the 20s. That's the roaring 20s when the stock market boosted the wealth of rich folks. But then coming out of that, even before the Depression hits, steady, sharp increases in equality, a narrowing of the gap between rich folks and poor folks. That continues upward, hits a peak, sort of what you might have thought was a peak in about 1945, just after World War II, a little bit of a post-war slump, but then coming out of that, even more greater equality. And you can see that the peak of equality in this whole period is around 1960. I do not mean America was a perfect equal, you know, like commune. Of course not. There were gaps between rich and poor even then, but certainly compared to any other time in American history, that comes close to being one of the most equal times, at least since we were all, you know, peasant farmers living on in the East Coast. But then after that, as the 60s begin, there begin to see a greater inequality, a decline in inequality goes down steadily down through the 70s, and then beginning around 1980, a sharp plunge toward greater and greater inequality. The gap between the rich and poor keeps narrowing steadily all the way down through the 90s and through the first decade of the 21st century. It looked about, as we got partway through the, you know, around 2015, it looked like maybe we were going to stop becoming more equal. But then, as anybody knows now, the last 5 years since the numbers plunged even further, as first of all the Trump tax cuts, and then the takeoff of the stock market, and then of course the virus, which has again exacerbated still further the gap between rich and poor. So if we had the graph down to where it is right now, it would be down actually a little lower than the green point is. Yeah, it would be down about there. That's about how, so we're back at where we were at the beginning. And we're in a second Gilded Age, we could say. So let's go to the third graph, which looks a little bit more at social connectedness, what I, in some books, call social capital. It's the degree to which, what's measured here is the degree to which Americans are connected with their friends and family and neighbors, the degree to which they know their neighbors, trust their people, other people in society, the degree to which they, belong to church groups or belong to civic organizations, belong to bowling leagues or the equivalent of that, or the degree to which their families are, they have good, strong family ties. As you can see in 1890, this begins with social capital at a very low ebb, social cohesion at a very low ebb, lots of very isolated people. In a minute, Shaylyn will tell you sort of what that felt like on the ground, but the data show very clearly America was very socially isolated in that at the end of the 19th century, in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. And but then beginning in around 1900, you see that begin to have more connections, and you see it steadily rises there. There's a bit of a pause in the 20s. Again, we see that pause in the 20s, but then coming out of the 20s and into the 30s, sharp rises. The period between 1940 and 1960 was probably the greatest civic boom in American history. Every organization in America was, bowling leagues and men's groups and the Scouts, and every organization in America, it seemed, was doubling its membership almost every year. It was amazing. But then suddenly, silently, mysteriously at first, beginning on you can see the date there, beginning 1964, suddenly we fall away from that. And what lies behind this steady downward trend, just plunging steadily downward, is what lies behind that is steadily plunging trust. People less and less likely to trust other people, steadily plunging membership in group organizations, fewer and fewer people in bowling leagues. As the book title then said, we were bowling alone. And the book Bowling Alone, I published that in the year 2000. And we only had the data through 2000, obviously. But you could see what happened after 2000. It was going straight down. It was like I had prophesied exactly what was going to happen, even after I wrote the book. Steady decline in group membership, steady decline in social trust, steady decline in family stability, more and more people not getting married, or maybe getting married very late. And if they do get married, having fewer kids. So all these forms of social cohesion retrace what looks now like this same darn chart, this inverted U. It's quite haunting that these are different kinds of measures. One is a measure of economics, one's a measure of politics, one's a measure of our social lives, but they all show the same basic inverted U curve. Let's go to the last one on, this is the next chart, which will show cultural trends. The underlying idea here is, to what extent do we think of ourselves in any given era? Do we think of ourselves as all in this together, or are we thinking of ourselves as, I'm number one? One way to put that is, to what extent are we thinking of ourselves as an I isolated society, or as a we society, in which we're more focused on the things that we share in common? And this curve later on becomes the label for all of these curves. We call it the I curve. It's I over there where the pointer is now. It's we up at the top around 1960, and it's I back down at the bottom where we are now. We're back in an I society. One reason we call it that, and there are many different measures underneath this graph, and I'm going to have to try to be quick I'm not going to summarize all of them. I do want to mention one. One is it comes from a website called Ngram, N-G-R-A-M. Google has digitized all books ever published ever in American history. And it's not just, academic books. It's mostly not. It's mostly, fiction, science fiction, children's books, gardening books, travel books, all sorts of fiction and non-fiction, detective stories, they're all in there. And you can look at these, at that website, Ngram, you can put in any word you want, and it'll show you the trends in the use of that word over the last, in this case, 125 years. So you can look at, for example, the trends in the word Lincoln, and the word Lincoln looks like over time like this until 1865. There's suddenly a jump. Well, that's because Lincoln was assassinated, and then and it stays high because there have always been a lot of books on Lincoln, the president, ever since. Or you can look at very common words like the. The word "the" is one of the most common, or even the word "a," simply "a." Is one of the most common words in the English language. You look over time, and that graph is absolutely flat. The word "the" or the word "a" is no more common today than it was in 1910 or 1850 or 1640. So this is a very interesting chart, and I got the idea maybe we could just use it to measure trends in I versus we. I mean, literally the word I and the word we. So we asked we put in the right parameters to this website, and we looked at the chart for the ratio of we to I. And that chart looks exactly like this chart. It's exactly like this chart. At the beginning of the period, people are writing books about I. The first person singular pronoun appears in them all the time, and not many people are writing. Remember, these are detective stories and garden books and so on. It's astonishing that you can see this in these charts. They start off, they're all talking about I. Nobody's writing about we gardeners, or whatever, a children's book about we. They're all about I. And then by the middle of the century, it's all about we. People are just talking about we gardeners and we the people. And by the time we get to the end of the century, it's back to I. And all we're writing about and reading about are I. So that's a little bit about the taste of the data. If we go to the next slide quickly, what we'll see in the next slide is that there's this here, we have all four of those charts together. You can see they're the same darn chart. You can see the trend there for economics and for politics and for society and culture. You can hardly tell them apart because they're all the same chart. If we go to the next slide, we can see what they look like all together. The next slide is a composite of just all of them. There it is. That's the I curve. Starts in a very I period. That's when economics is very unequal, politics is very polarized, society is very fragmented, culture is very I. You can see that there's that pause in the 20s that we noticed before, but then going up, reaching a peak at the beginning of the 1960s, in which we're relatively equal, relatively cooperative politically, relatively connected socially, and relatively focused on what we have in common, not on what divides us. But then the long downward slump back to an I society. But that's what the data looks like. Shaylyn, can you jump in now and talk a little bit more about what the stories are that are behind that chart, and maybe say a little bit about which part of that chart we wanted to focus on?
Sure. So, as Bob started off his comments mentioning that we're in a multifaceted crisis today. That's not something that's a surprise to anyone. And so there's been a lot of books written about how we got into this mess, but a lot of those books, and most of them, I would say, focus on the last half century, essentially the downturn of this curve, the part where we sort of fell from grace. And in those books, we get a sense of this idea that America was great at mid-century, and we somehow need to turn back the clock or move back to, some sort of supposed golden age in American history to learn, what we should do today. Our take on this is quite a bit different, actually. By zooming the lens out and looking not just at the last half century, but at the last century and a quarter, essentially, we can see that we were in a mess very similar to the one that we are living in today in the early 1900s. And so we find that, looking at the moment when an upswing culminated is much less instructive than looking at the last time we moved from a downturn and into an upswing. The main lesson here, from our perspective, is that we've successfully weathered a storm very similar to the one that we're in today once before, and we can do it again. And that means that we want to focus our efforts on looking at the moment when the Gilded Age, in that late 1800s, early 1900s, gave way to the Progressive Era, when a determined group of reformers set in motion a sea change in American society that really helped us reclaim our nation's promise. And so what we want to focus on now is maybe some of the lessons, again, not from this supposed golden age of mid-century America, but the lessons from the last time we pulled ourselves up and out of a mess so similar to the one that we're in today. So if we can just go to the next slide, what I want to highlight here are just a few of the lessons from that moment, from the lessons from America's last upswing. Now, I want to just pause for a moment and say we're going to refer to the progressive era, which is that era of American history that started roughly in the 1900s, but we're using the term progressive in a different way than it would be used today. Today, the term progressive, what you might call small p progressivism, refers to the leftmost end of the political spectrum, right? The progressive era, however, capital P progressivism, was not necessarily a partisan thing. It was a very bipartisan movement. In fact, historians have called the progressive movement of this era so diverse as to be barely coherent. It was a movement that consisted of a lot of competing factions, people fighting for a lot of different types of reforms, often in disagreement with one another. But it was a group of reformers that were really had a couple of things in common. One was a compelling desire to repudiate this downward drift of our nation that they found themselves in. And secondly, they had a galvanizing belief in the power of ordinary citizens to create change. And so there are a few lessons that we can learn from these reformers who pulled us up and out. It's important to really recognize that the last Gilded Age, on a remarkable, even I would say breathtaking number of dimensions, really parallels the moment that we're living in today. It was very, very similar. And so sometimes it's easy to look at the moment we're living through and just sort of despair and say they've never been this bad and maybe they'll never get any better. However, that's really not the case. We've been here before and we can change it again. So this is a statistical story, largely. The statistics form the backbone of the story in this book. And so a lot of times people will say, well, if we can identify which of the curves turned upward first, then we might be able to identify some sort of silver bullet, or in statistical terms, what we might call the leading indicator. If we can know which of the things started to turn upward first, then maybe we could know where to focus our efforts today, right? And so a lot of times people assume that what changed first was economics. That bias comes especially, I think, out of the social sciences, where we tend to think that economics drives everything. There's this kind of Marxist view of history where everything is economics and the rest is sort of just details, right? And what's fascinating about this particular statistical story is that it looks as though, it's actually quite clear in the data that economics is a lagging indicator, meaning that economics was one of the last things to change. We moved toward economic equality after we began moving toward political cooperation or cultural solidarity or social solidarity. And so if economics was the lagging indicator, if that's not what's leading this story, the question then becomes, what was leading the story? It's a little bit hard to tell because for every one of the graphs that Bob showed you, each one of those graphs represents, scores of underlying independent measures that we're looking at. So we're looking at a lot of different things here. And sometimes it's really hard to tease out what exactly happened in a story where these trends are very much interbraided. However, it looks like when you pair the statistical data with the historical record, it seems clear that what started to change first was actually culture. That what led the progressive era, what led this upswing, was a moral awakening. So Bob mentioned again the Gilded Age. And the culture that really characterized the Gilded Age was something called social Darwinism. At the time, Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest was a new thing. He had articulated a theory to describe the natural world. And people began to migrate that into the social sphere and say, oh, well, maybe this is how societies should work as well. Survival of the fittest. We should fashion our societies as one giant competition, and only the strong will survive. And, the devil take the hindmost. And this was sort of the reigning cultural philosophy of the day behind the robber barons and the explosion of wealth at the expense of, people working on the factory lines. And this moral awakening that came in the wake of social Darwinism actually began in evangelical Protestantism. there was a movement in Protestantism called the social gospel, where Christian preachers, Christian theologians began to look at Christianity itself as a moral system and say, you know, this idea of Christians as, you know, the shining city on the hill and the unwashed masses below is actually not what Christ had in mind when he outlined the gospel. And these theologians began to articulate sort of a more social Christianity, a Christianity based on the idea that society is here to take care of its most vulnerable, that it's not one giant competition, that it's about cooperation and it's about the power of what we can do together. And again, this started off in religion, but it became something that was more of a broad cultural phenomenon that began to change the moral underpinning of the decisions we began to make as a society. And, you know, it's important to recognize that this moral awakening that was happening in the progressive era was more than just an effort to sort of identify the bad apples of society and expel them. It was not kind of a cancel culture type of morality. The historian Richard Hofstadter described it as moral indignation directed inward. Largely progressives were elites, not exclusively. Again, there were a lot of immigrants and a lot of young women organizing in this era. But a lot of these progressives were elites who began to sort of have these moral moments where they began to be in touch with the consequences of this elite-driven society. And they began to see the ways in which they were complicit in creating these gross inequalities and this extremely competitive and uncooperative culture. And they began to make changes accordingly. So it's really fascinating that if we might look to build another upswing today, it's really important to recognize that it seems like culture and a reevaluation of our moral values was what began to drive the upswing last time. Another important lesson from the upswing is that it was extremely youth-driven. These progressive reformers were largely under the age of 30 when they were doing their most energetic and important and innovative work. These were young people who had who found themselves in an entirely changed world and felt that they had to reinvent society in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And so that young, innovative energy really drove this upswing. And we believe that will be the case again today. Another lesson here is that progressives really believed in the power of association. That's kind of an antiquated word. We might use a word like relationship or connection today, but it's the same concept, right? And they saw association as both an end and a means. And what I mean by that is, as Bob noted in the data, this was a time of extreme social isolation, loneliness, dislocation. And that really was a product of the huge demographic and economic shifts that had happened during the Industrial Revolution. The previous generation of Americans had lived in small towns and on small farms and had worked in small businesses, or had owned their own businesses or were subsistence farming. And then a generation later, everything had shifted. So you had millions of Americans moving out of these small towns into busy, isolated, commerce-driven cities where the sort of quilting bees and barn raisings that their parents had relied upon for social connection just weren't going to cut it on in Chicago, right? And so a lot of the progressives were responding to that loneliness and that feeling of isolation that they felt as they moved into the cities. And they began to invent new ways of bringing people together. And as they did that, they began to realize the power of these associations. And of course, through Bob's work on social capital, we know that social capital is a driver of a lot of other positive things in society, particularly the health of democracies. And the progressives began to recognize this, that the more that they were able to bring people together, especially across lines of difference, they were able to create a powerful store of social capital. And that ultimately sort of fueled this upswing for decades. And so any upswing that we would hope to see today really is going to need to be relationship-driven, connection-driven, something that rebuilds our stores of social capital to carry us forward. Another lesson here was that this was a time of enormous grassroots innovation. These morally awakened young people were channeling their moral outrage and their moral indignation into building things, into citizen engagement. They were reclaiming their individual agency in the face of a society that was totally changed, dizzying drift and complexity. And they were saying, you know what, I still have power to act as a citizen. And they began working right where they were, at the neighborhood level, at the municipal level, at the tenement level, to solve the problems where they were encountering them. And through these efforts, they were essentially able to create innovative policy solutions that kind of bubbled up into what ultimately became the big national programs that we often think of as characterizing the progressive era. And so the progressive era ultimately was this sort of bottom-up and top-down combination that created broad change in America. And so we're going to need to see a lot of grassroots activism if we want to see another upswing today. Another important point here is that the charismatic political leadership that we sometimes think of in Teddy Roosevelt and others from this period was another lagging indicator. The Teddy Roosevelts came along and sort of translated this grassroots uprising into programs and policies that could achieve bipartisan appeal. But that wasn't where it started. It wasn't some charismatic leader who came and outlined a blueprint for a new America. On the contrary, that sort of national progressive mindset came later. Now, I've outlined a lot of positive lessons from this era of American history, and there's a lot to be learned that we could potentially apply today. But not all of the lessons are positive. There are a lot of cautionary tales that come out of this era of American history as well. And I'll just touch on one briefly here. And that was simply that the we being created during that first 2/3 of the 20th century was not inclusive enough. The progressives, whose efforts were lauding here as having sort of saved America from our last downturn, were themselves largely racist. And so the programs and solutions and policies that they built were often racialized. And a lot of the sort of structural racism and structural inequality that we're dealing with today were sort of built into a lot of those programs that had their origins in the upswing. And so the fact that the needs of people of color were essentially sacrificed on the altar of progress was something that essentially created the inevitable demise of the upswing. And maybe we can talk about that a bit later if we can touch on that in the questions, because that's something that our readers often want to hear more about. But the point here is that if we're going to engage in activities similar to those of the progressives, we will need to take full inclusion, the building of a truly inclusive and diverse we, as the very first and foremost activity that we need to engage in order to see another upswing happen. So if we can just go to the last slide here, I'll just leave you with this thought, which actually is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Whether we recognize it or not, whether we lean into it or not, as we have done variously over time, we are all in this together, and our fates are ultimately bound up with one another." And that, I think, is the biggest lesson of this I century that we're hoping to help more Americans recognize. And I think that we've been here before, but we can do it again. We can see another upswing, and it's our hope that will be what the future holds for America.
Thank you both so much for that presentation. Super interesting. There's such a lot of things to consider and reflect on here. If we were in person, it's the tradition of the forum to offer the first question to a student. And so I'd love to begin, Justin, with a comment or question that you might have in response to this.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hain. And thank you again, Bob and Shaylyn, for your presentation. It was extremely interesting and extremely relative to what's going on right now. I just actually wanted to ask, in your book, you do mention via Robert Schiller, the idea of the American dream. And it really appears that at one point, the American dream was more of a moral foray rather than this, this grandiose and very extreme drive towards the acquisition of things, wealth, luxury, by any means possible. So what I want to know is that, seeing how the American dream was a point of morality at one point, especially during the point when we were a we, is it important for us right now to really try to reevaluate, represent, and kind of have conversations about what the American dream means now in order to get it back to the point where it's more about a moral drive towards freedom, mutual respect, and equality and opportunity for all?
Justin, that is a brilliant question. I'm very glad you asked that question. We don't devote enough time, actually, even in the book, but certainly not in this presentation, to that transition in the use of the word American dream. Look, the idea the ideal, the moral ideal in America that everybody should have equal opportunity, that you should go up, you should rise as far as your own talents will take you, but you shouldn't, your success in life shouldn't depend on what your parents did or didn't do. That goes back actually to the Declaration of Independence, where in that they were limited, but they nevertheless said all men are created equal. And they said men, they didn't say women, and they meant all white men, but successive leaders, including Martin Luther King, talked about that as a promissory note. We said when we founded this darn country that all men, and now we would say all men and all women of all races and all races, are guaranteed, start from the beginning, you have a fair start. And that idea that we all have an equal opportunity or should have an equal opportunity has permeated much of American history. The term the American dream actually didn't come into common use until 1931, when it was introduced by a social theorist at that point. And exactly as you say, when he used the word, he was talking about a collective achievement. The American dream means we're all in this together. That's what he said the American dream was. We're all in this together and we all have a fair chance. How well men and women, and at that point he began to use the word women too in this context, all American men and all American women, all of us should do as well as we can given our own talents. We should not be constrained by what our parents did or didn't do. That's what the American dream meant at the beginning. That's what it meant, as you say, right in that we period. It was smack in the middle of the period of rising we. But then beginning in around 1970, it's so interesting, exactly as you say, just about the time that we stopped being as a country, be focused on we, beginning more focused on I, the term American dream changes its meaning. People, basically, I would say, pilfered the idea of the American dream and turned it into me. The American dream is you personally can achieve the American dream if you personally have a nice car or a nice house in the suburbs. And if you look now, that's the way the American dream, it's described in individual terms and it's described in material terms. And that switch in meaning of the term and the way it's used captures precisely what was going on in the larger city, in the largest community. I mean, it was the move from it's a moral move. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. That captures the fact that we moved from a period in which we all thought it was a moral obligation. Not me, none of us were around then, but in that period, we thought the Americans thought it was a moral obligation to make sure that everybody had a fair chance. And when we didn't do that, as we didn't in the case of gender and especially race, as Shaylyn may have a chance to talk about in a minute when we talk directly about race, that disconnect between our values and the reality itself had consequences. It wasn't just, oh, well, we're not going to worry about these other folks here. So yes, that the American dream, the use of the term American dream is a really important insight. Thank you for noticing that.
No, you've mentioned a couple times, both of you, the race issue here. And I think, well, let me phrase a question about this that picks up on the general theme of your presentation. It seems like the first half of the century, 20th century, was a good thing, and the second half something to be regretted. Whereas I think typically when we think about race, we think about the first half of the 20th century as much more problematic. Jim Crow, lynchings, the revival of the KKK, for example. And then in the 60s, instead of being a moment of loss, it's a moment of accomplishment. And the second half of the 20th century is a better story for us when it comes to race. So I'm wondering how that fits into your story.
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. And of course, no discussion of I and we in American history can skirt the question of race, right? No discussion of the concept of we cannot include a question about race. And so maybe what we'll do here is if you would bring up the PowerPoint again, we've got a couple of slides just at the end of the PowerPoint there that might illustrate a bit how this story of race in America sort of squares or doesn't square with the I, we, I story of the century. So this is not a graph that reflects actual statistics. We've created this graph to just sort of reflect what is kind of the common story about race in America, that because as the 19th century ended, the outlook for African Americans was so bleak. In the wake of Reconstruction, there had been a lot of progress, and then Southern redemption happened, a violent reclaiming of white hegemony that reversed all of that progress and instituted the Black codes and ultimately Jim Crow. And so there's often a sense that sort of reality for African Americans in this country persisted all the way up until the 1960s. So this is what we kind of call the hockey stick story of race in American history, where it's a flat line, right? No progress. And then right in the 1960s, finally, with the civil rights movement, we see a lot of progress toward racial equality. So this actually turns out to be true for some things. It turns out to be true for things like the longstanding lack of representation, political representation for Black Americans. It turns out to be true for things like, roughly speaking, for things like residential segregation or the longstanding lack of entry into professional schools and professions for Black Americans. So there were a lot of exclusionary things that really didn't change until the 1960s. However, the story is more complicated than that. So if we go to the next slide, what you'll see here is a graphic representation of progress toward material equality between white Americans and Black Americans over this period. So this graph represents actual statistics, whereas the other one was there sort of as kind of a representation of our common thinking about race. So here on the y-axis, you'll see it goes up to 1.0. So at the very top, 1.0 would represent complete equality between Blacks and white Americans. And then across the x-axis, you see this same time frame that you've seen on the graphs we showed previously. Now, as you can see, at no point did America approach total equality, actually not even really close to total equality between the races. The other thing that I should just say here is the reason that we're talking about Black Americans versus white Americans is not because we want to ignore other peoples of color, but simply because those are the groups for whom we have data spanning this full period, right? Latinos or other peoples of color were not broken out and when it comes to statistical measures over this full period. So we're looking specifically at Black versus white Americans. And so what this shows is actually a too slow, but nonetheless unmistakable decades-long drive toward equality before the Civil Rights Revolution, which I think to a lot of white Americans is a big surprise. It's not a big surprise to Black Americans because this is sort of their own genealogy. There was a lot of progress. And when we talk about material equality, we're talking about things like the relative income, home ownership, wealth distribution. We're talking about things like health, infant mortality rates, and life expectancy. We're also talking about educational opportunity and the completion of degrees. We're also talking about voter participation and voter registration, right? So these are really important measures of equality between the races. And you can see that actually the fastest progress toward equality was made in that roughly 1940 to 1970 period, before the passage of the civil rights legislation. And then actually after that civil rights moment, you see not an acceleration of progress, but actually a stagnation of progress. We call this the foot off the gas period, when America was making progress. And you would think that, you know, this upward progress toward equality, when we finally dismantled the de jure segregation with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, that drive toward equality would have just accelerated. And in fact, it stalled. And in many cases, on many individual measures, actually reversed. For example, homeownership today is for Black Americans is lower than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. These are really sort of shocking statistics, because I think, again, for white Americans, the view is sort of like things were really bad before the civil rights movement, and then we sort of fixed things and things have gotten so much better. Again, that's true on some things. It's really not true on a lot of other things. And so this, of course, forms the backdrop to the racial unrest that we've seen in the last year. You know, why are Americans taking to the streets to raise awareness about racial inequality in this country? Well, it's largely because the promises of the civil rights movement never really bore fruit. right? Particularly in this material sense. And so Black communities are struggling in the same way that they were more than half a century previous to today. And so that anger and that frustration in Black communities is very, very real and very illustrated by the fact that this sort of stagnation of progress. But the other part of the story here is what was happening before the civil rights movement. And you might ask the question, well, how was it possible that Black Americans were making such rapid progress, and even more rapid progress than white Americans during this period? And that largely is a story of Black Americans standing up and claiming their own place within the American we, largely through the Great Migration, leaving the oppressive South and moving into northern and western cities where they could build businesses and they could vote and they could attend college and do other things that they couldn't do in the South. And that resulted in, huge strides toward material equality. And so I think here, one of the lessons when we sort of pair this with the I data is that it turns out that the we decades surprisingly were a bit more hospitable to racial progress than the I decades have been. And you might ask, well, why did things stall and stagnate in this sort of I period, this sort of post-1970 period in America? Well, part of that story is the broader cultural shift back toward an I alone mentality. But another part of the story is, frankly, white backlash to the civil rights movement. It was not an accident that it was at the peak of that American we-ness that we were able to pass civil rights legislation. But the moment that it became less about, just passing the laws and more about implementing integration and actually sharing the pie, there was a real sort of not in my backyard phenomenon that happened with white Americans. And to me, that says that we had never really done the heart work of racial reconciliation. Again, we talked about how the progressives kind of kicked that can down the road, so to speak. And that, in a sense, meant that the upswing had knit into it the seeds of its own demise, that we really didn't do the work to widen the we fully, and I guess in our hearts and not just in our laws and regulations. And so there's a lot more work to do on this. And of course, this has to be absolutely the starting point for any upswing that we would want to see today.
Thanks very much. I'd like to now have a question from our audience. This is from a colleague of ours, Terry McGoldrick, who's a member of the theology department here. And he says, trust, moral awakening, and love of neighbor seem to be the currency of religion. Do you see a particularly important place for faith communities in rebuilding social capital?
Well, shall I say something about that, Shaylyn? So the answer is yes. It's an easy yes. And I'm secular, so I'm not speaking out of that kind of bias, at least. Religion turns out to be a very special form of what I call social capital. In an earlier book published about 10 or 12 years ago called American Grace, David Campbell and Shaylyn and I provided actually pretty strong statistical evidence that religious people are nicer than other people. Controlling for everything you can imagine, religious people are more likely to help old ladies across the street, more likely to contribute financially, and not just in the offering plate, but to secular causes and so on. But what the findings also showed is it wasn't the theology actually that made people who were religious nicer, it's the community of the church. It's the fact that you belong to a community, not what you believe, that turns out to lead you to be so powerfully pro-social. This is not a talk about that book, so I'm going to leave that there, except to say, yes, I believe that religion, as we'd already said, in the form of the social gospel, was a very important part the last time we went through this, and for the very reason that you're implying, the question is implying, namely that it raised these moral issues. On the other hand, we also have to keep in mind that religion is a very powerful It's very powerful, but it can be used as a tool that can be used for good or for ill. And I would not say that I think that all parts of the American religious community at the moment are contributing to the prospects of greater equality and depolarization and getting along and so on. I don't want to get too controversial here, but I have to say that I think a large part of, at least part of contemporary American evangelicalism is actually not pulling on the right oar, so to speak. And it is a very complicated question because actually a lot of Black people are evangelicals, and they, for my most part, my money, a lot of them today exactly are raising moral issues exactly the right way. I'm sorry, Shaylyn, I'm blanking on the name of the Black evangelical.
The Reverend William Barber is a great example of pairing moral language with social questions, right? Which is what began to happen in the last progressive era. And so that's a great hopeful sign of religious leaders helping us find our moral language around social issues.
Absolutely. But I would want to add, Raymond, if we had more time, I'd want to add, and it's probably obvious what I'm referring to. There are a lot of people on the, I guess you'd call it the right religiously, a lot of religious conservatives who are not, from my point of view, I think, are not really following what Jesus talked about when he talked about the need to take care of everybody and to be open and tolerant and so on. I would say, for example, I don't want to get too, again, I'm getting awfully controversial here, but I think Pope Francis is actually a really good example of what I would want, as somebody who has a very strong moral voice. He doesn't, he's just already said what he thinks about gay marriage, so it's not like he's a softie on a lot of moral issues, but his emphasis, that is the fact that he keeps going on about, the way the original St. Francis did, about the importance of caring for the least of them, and the importance of worrying about immigrants, and the importance of his whole ministry, actually, is an affirmation of what I think of the moral voice that we need to have spoken more. I mean, honestly, I'm not Catholic at all. I'm not even Christian. But if I were to say who's the voice now speaking that illustrates the kind of witness, religious witness that we need at this stage, it's Pope Francis. And there are a lot of people in other religions too who are doing the same thing.
I think we may have time for two more questions if we're quick. I'd like to give the next one to Justin, and then I've got one from the audience to finish up.
Let me say one thing, Raymond. I talked a little too long. So if we want to go, if you guys had time for another 5 minutes or so, that's penalty time, or a penalty that I incurred.
That sounds great. Justin.
Yeah, mine is actually going to be super quick, actually. So, I was just thinking about this is kind of like a general question. I was just thinking about how, is it possible that Americans might just be afraid or unwilling to become we again to the extreme amounts of competition that permeate through our society? And I'm just speaking about that through being a college student, and many college students understand the rigorous amounts of competition that go into finding a great school, because behind that is finding a great job in an ever increasingly competitive workplace. So I'm wondering if maybe we've actually created a society that is unable to consider we, because it's almost too preoccupied attempting to ensure the longevity and the success of I. And if that happens to be the case, what do you guys think could be the steps that we can take gradually? Because obviously, these things don't change over time quickly.
Justin, but Justin, what's your short question? That's your very
that's my long question. Yeah, I lied.
I'm going to try to. No, I'm joking. I'm teasing you.
Yeah,
I'm going to try to answer parts of that question, and then Shaylyn will too. And then we'll try to come back, Raymond, for another question or two after this. The first thing I say is that competition that you've described is very largely a material composition. That is competition about material goods. And what we're saying to young people is it's not just about material goods. Happiness is, now I'm going to sound like a preacher. Happiness is not about material goods. Happiness is about connections with other people. And when I say that, I'm making a scientific statement. We know there have been lots of studies about what made people happy, a lot of studies about what, and having a little more money makes you a little happier. Having a lot more money does not make you a lot happier. What makes you happy are your connections with other people. That's what people say if you ask people, what makes you happy? They don't say, what made me happy was that, you know, the great home I've got. They say, what makes me happy is getting together with my grandmother or getting together with my grandchildren. People know, and the evidence shows this, that, and so I am being a little bit of a preacher here, to be competitive about things that will not in the end give you satisfaction is not very intelligent. And so it's not hard realism to say, well, it's very competitive out there. It's dog eat dog. We got to be, focus on I. And I'm saying that is actually not true. I don't mean to be taking issue with you personally, Justin. I'm taking issue with this attitude. I guess the second thing, well, I've gone on too long. Shaylyn, will you say something, Shaylyn, about agency? I want to make sure we say something about agency here.
Sure. I mean, I'll just pick up there as well by saying, one of the threads that I heard in your question, Justin, is it's never been this bad before. Like, we've never been so competitive. Maybe it's just a lost cause. We've gone too far down that road, right? And I totally understand that sentiment. However, what I want to just flag is, part of my job on this book was to really dig into what life was like in the Gilded Age. Before the Progressive Era happened. And I was stunned at how similar the experience that people described, this relentless sort of rush to get ahead and the relentless competition, and that as what society had become oriented around, right? And so that is not a new thing. I think it's a feature of this I-oriented cultural orientation that we have found ourselves, that we've created, essentially. So if we've created it, we can uncreate it, right? And that's where the question of agency comes in. The Progressive Era, anyone who's looked at our book will know that the last chapter of our book is titled Drift and Mastery. And we took that title actually from a famous Progressive Era tract of the same name, for Drift and Mastery, by Walter Lippmann. It was written in 1914. And the basic premise of that book is we have a choice. We can either drift along with history, sort of with this mindset that we don't have any control over the environment in which we find ourselves in, or we can engage in mastery. We can grab the reins of history and say, the tide in which I'm swimming is not working for me, and I'm going to stem the tide. And that's really what the progressives did. That was what Walter Lippmann was calling upon people to do. And I would say we actually are beginning to see that. The millennials, for example, that I've recruited and employed, in my nonprofit work, they were incredibly purpose-driven, as well as being, I think that there's a mindset of like, I have to compete and I have to succeed, but there's a hunger underneath it for something more. And I think the more that young people can lean into that hunger and demand an economy that is more oriented around purpose and more oriented around what we can do for one another, the more we're going to see that shift. And that's a brave choice. I mean, I graduated from college in the heyday of Bain and Company and McKinsey recruiting all the best minds in America right into, iBanking and consulting. And it was a really hard thing to resist that and go into nonprofit work, which is what I did. But the more people that will do that, the more the society will reorient itself in that way. That's the only truth of this book, is that there's no inevitability to whether we plunge further down this darkening path or whether we pull it up and reverse it into an upswing. It has everything to do with the choices that we make collectively and whether we can get critical mass pulling the society in a different direction.
And when Shaylyn says that, she means you, Justin, and it's old people like me can maybe see the problem because we've been around a long time, but we're not going to fix the problem. It's going to be the people watching. I am preaching, Raymond. It's going to be the people watching this class who are going to determine the future of America. That's not blah, blah, blah. That's just a true fact. And as Shaylyn said, we're kind of optimistic that can happen. And we think the old folks like me should do what we can to help things along. But this is a moral calling that has very practical, very, very practical implications for poor kids currently growing up in bad circumstances, in across all races actually, and genders and sexual orientations and so on. The rest of us have to take action.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, and I'm going to integrate the question from our audience and follow up with just a little bit. And let me apologize ahead of time to those of you whose questions I'm not going to get to. We have lots of great ones, and I wish we had all the time in the world to go through everything. Your book has an interesting tension in it. On the one hand, the scope is very large. We recognize the place we're in right now as the result of decades, over a century, of development in a particular direction. That can make us feel like we can't affect the outcome of at least the immediate future. Mm-hmm. But as you just said just now, the end of your book is particular stories about individuals in the progressive era. And your call to us is that it's up to each particular person who has the ability, at least on a small local level, to create some change. So this is a question from James Bailey, a colleague of ours. He says, you discussed the fact that the turnaround of the progressive era began by building things on a local level. And could you give some examples of the things you have in mind, maybe that were built during this era that might apply to today? And let me just offer a couple wrinkles here. I think the recent bailout package provides some interesting reflection on what's happening over the last year. I know we set that aside in the discussion, but I'm thinking, for example, of Mitt Romney's support of the child tax credit expansion, the reflection by Ross Dowlett in the New York Times, who's a commentator on the right, who also came out in support of that. And just to add one other wrinkle, would you say something like the following? Students should, go to a great school, and then maybe they should return home, go back to the Midwest or the South or whatever it is, and try to renew the place from which they came.
Maybe I'll start by just giving a specific example from the progressive era, and then I maybe will pass it to Bob for some comments about the rescue plan. Does that sound good, Bob?
Yeah.
So great question about, can we see some specific examples? And one that we love to tell the story of is the American high school movement. So we're talking about the first 2/3 of the 20th century, which is characterized economically by something called the Great Compression, when the pie was being shared more equally as it grew, right? Economically across the board. And one of the drivers of that was the high school revolution. The fact that, within a couple of decades, all American kids started going to high school for free. And sometimes we look at that and think, well, that must have been a federal program, right? The reality of that story actually is that the public high school movement began in small towns in the Midwest. Now, this is not to say that there was no such thing as public high schools before that. There were some high schools that you could go to, but largely they were for elites. Largely they were paid. And if you went for free, it was usually because you had to be exceptionally talented or something like that. But the fact that of having a high school in your town that you got to attend for free to get a 4-year secondary education simply by virtue of living in that town was an entirely new invention. And it was something that happened as people in small towns looked around at a changed economy and said, my kid's not going to succeed if he doesn't have a secondary education, but I can't afford to send him to Boston for that. So why don't we band together, pass local tax initiatives, and create a high school that's available to everyone? I can't afford to do it on my own, but I can afford to do it if we band together. And when small towns in the Midwest began succeeding at this, other towns began seeing it, copying it, and essentially it spread like wildfire. And so within a couple of decades, almost every town in America had a free public high school. Now, of course, then there were ways in which the government got involved and that sort of a thing. But this is an important story of how one of the biggest drivers of economic equalization over the first 2/3 of the 20th century originated by innovative people in their own small towns solving a problem right outside their doorstep. So that's one really important story of how this could happen. So for the other side of that story, now I'll pass it to Bob to talk about some of the national legislation that we're now seeing implemented in the United States.
Yes, thank you, Shaylyn, and thank you, Raymond, for asking that question. And I'm sure you realize it's a big question, not conceptually big, but I'm going to be talking about $1.9 trillion, which is a lot of money. So I wanted to just get a little bit of a running start here. about 10 years ago, when I wrote the book called Our Kids, and it was about this growing opportunity gap between rich kids and poor kids. And afterwards, I convened a task force of about 30 experts, nonpartisan experts, many different disciplines, economics, sociology, education, political science, etc., over a period of weeks to put together a book which we called Closing the Opportunity Gap. And we listed in it about 30 or 40 different things that if you wanted to do, you could narrow the opportunity gap and begin to make this country one country again. At the time, it was, in the very worst possible sense, an academic study. It didn't seem to have any chances of being implemented. And to make things worse, within months of that, we elected an I alone president. And so it was clearly not going anywhere. Fast forward now to the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. If you go through that plan, virtually every one of these dozens of recommendations that we laid out in that nonpartisan list of experts, virtually every one of them is funded in the $1.9 trillion, including the biggest ticket of all, essentially a very large universal child tax credit, child allowance, which is what both Russ Douthat and Mitt Romney have also put forward. And actually, there are other Republicans who have also previously, before we got to this point, endorsed a similar kind of program. How partisan is that? Well, if you look at the votes in Congress, it's completely partisan. There's not a single Republican who's voted for that. But if you look at public opinion polls, 70% of all Americans, including roughly half of all Republicans in America, think that the things that are in that bill are good. And it's even larger when you look at particular things like, for example, that child allowance. I think the figure is 85% of Americans think that's a good idea. Remember, what's that mean? 85% of Americans say we ought to be investing a ton more than we had been recently in giving poor kids and their families a leg up. Now, why do I get so excited? Well, I get excited because I'm an excitable guy. But if you think about it, what that means is an overwhelming majority of ordinary Americans, forget about Republican Party leaders for the moment, an overwhelming majority of ordinary Americans of both political parties think we ought to invest a ton more in not just in helping poor kids, but in righting this society and moving us in a more egalitarian, less polarized direction. That's about as close as I think we could have possibly imagined seeing the evidence of a moral cultural renewal. That's what a moral cultural renewal is, when a large section of the country thinks, look, we've been on the wrong path. There's a different path we could take. That is exactly what happened over a longer period of time, I have to say, in the progressive era. Large numbers of people changed their minds about what morality required of us. And I think, of course, I'm partly praising the bill, but it's not the praising of the bill that I'm describing. It's what the reaction to this in this country has been. I mean, if you just go out and talk to people of either party or of no party, that seems to me, and so look, I get carried away, and I am a crazy optimist often, but I'm as close to, in my personal experience, I never have been in my lifetime more optimistic than I am right now. Not because I think the Democrats are going to win the midterm election, not that at all, but because I think we can see the signs of a moral change among ordinary Americans who said essentially enough is enough. We owe it to everybody to give them a fair chance. Sorry for the sermon, Raymond.
Thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience for being with us this afternoon. There's a lot to think about here, and it was an honor to have you with us at Providence College.
Thanks very much, Raymond. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Raymond.
Thanks, everybody who's watching.
Thank you. Appreciate it.